Chapter 13 Hunting 54, Pa McBride, Pig Farming. The tail end of Hurricane Hazel hit southern Ontario in October of '54, but because the harvest season was almost over, the damage to the fruit-growing area was not too serious. For me, only a few Kiefer pears and a few apples still hanging on the trees were lost. Pruned fruit trees, devoid of their crop, can withstand tremendous winds, so the orchard itself came off scot-free. We made arrangements to rent a summer home located on a small island in Hay Lake, a few miles south of Whitney, for the year's hunt. Our go-between was Mr. Scott, one of those northerners who is willing to just let things happen rather than make solid plans. Dick Henderson and Bing Harris made their first trip with our gang, which included Elmer Wilson, our cook, Ellis Corman, Ira Lee, George Howe, and myself for a party of 7. Our talking with Ira Lee, he reminded me that Dr. Alex Barnby was also on this trip, to make a party of 8. We followed our usual leave home at midnight, arrive at our destination before daylight plan, to find out that Mr. Scott was not there to meet us. He was to supply us with a boat to transport our equipment and explain in greater detail how to go to the house we had rented. We waited what seemed like forever, and still no Scott. Just before noon, we decided the only boat big enough among the 5 or 6 that were tied to the dock was a 25 flat-bottomed steel barge, 5 feet wide and built like a garbage scow. With knowing this was intended for us, we loaded all our stuff with plenty of room to spare, and put George Hawes' 3-horsepower outboard motor on the stern. That poor little motor was not a great deal better than an egg beater, and with any headwind we would have been lucky to maintain a position, never mind proceed forward. Just as we cleared the dock and gained the open water, about 1 mile an hour, here comes our great Scott. He was alone, piloting a 16-foot cedar strip boat with 2 25-horsepower outboards traveling at not less than 25 miles per hour. He made a complete circle around us to make sure it was us, and finally got it stopped so that he could talk to us. We received our final instructions and proceeded on. The island the cottage was located on was at the top of a narrow peninsula, exposed on 3 sides to the mercy of the cold fall winds off the lake from any direction. As it was built for summer use, a single layer of not too tight boards provided the only insulation. The main room was a combination dining living room and about 12 feet by 15 feet. Off that room were 2 fairly large bedrooms, and the 4th room, which seemed to be built on as an afterthought, was a small kitchen which contained an old cook stove, the only heat supply for the whole house. The roof was steep and high, and all the heat in the wood stove generated flowed through the kitchen door directly to the peak. We thought we had cold places before, but this topped them all. I thought Dick Henderson would be sick from laughing when he saw Elmer roll out of bed the first morning with all his clothes on, including a heavy winter overcoat and hat. The outhouse was located a fair distance away from the house towards the mainland, and nobody wasted any time out there either. The peninsula was heavily wooded with evergreens, and Hurricane Hazel had blown down about 1 tree out of every 3. They were lying on the ground in every direction, too low to get under and not close enough together to walk on top. It was little over 300 yards to the rest of our hunting grounds, which was mostly hardwood and still standing, but to struggle through that little bit took a lot of effort and too much time. We bypassed it as much as possible using a rowboat supplied by Mr. Scott. We decided to drive that little piece one morning. Elmer, George, and Doc went by boat to the far end of the evergreens to stand on to watch in a narrow clearing which crossed the peninsula. The rest of us fought through that mess, yelling and barking all the way towards our watchers. When we made it the first time, we were told that the deer had come to the edge of the clearing and turned back. They were still in there. We repeated this procedure twice more before 2 deer finally crossed the clearing and George shot one of them. I tell this only to describe how sneaky they can be. The area involved was about 300 yards by 100 yards wide, and yet 5 men had made 5 trips each, from one end to another without seeing or hearing a deer. We have either stupid men or clever deer. You decide." Dick Henderson supplied his fair share of the laughs, as he has with every trip after this one. Elmer took great pride in cooking a good meal, and it was after one of these evening meals that Dick complimented Elmer on his efforts. They were sitting at opposite ends, so when Dick rose to his feet, all eyes were on him. He finished his little say-so, and then trotted to the other end of the table to kiss Elmer on the forehead, saying, "That's what I would do at home if I got a meal like that." No one has ever been more surprised than Elmer, and when the shock wore off a little, he joined the laughter of the group. To appreciate this fully, you would have to remember Dick as the big, burly ex-Navy man standing in the center of the barge, loading it with apparent ease. He was clearing the dock as fast as the rest of the crew could deliver to him all the crates, boxes, and trunks that were, in some cases, a fair struggle for two men. Bing Harris is a better-than-average marksman, and it was his good luck to see game on this, his first trip north. Buck fever is that disease amateur hunters experience, where all standard rules and regulations for good shooting are disregarded and excitement and confusion take full command. Bing was no exception, and this is a story told to me. As a good-sized doe crossed in front of Bing, within easy range he began shooting. I do not know how many shots connected, but when the 16-shot Remington was empty, the deer was fatally wounded but still moving. Ira Lee also stood within easy range, poised and ready to make sure he did not escape, but rather than deprive Bing of a total conquest, he calmly waited. To his surprise, Bing began running towards the deer instead of taking time to reload his gun. When he got close enough, he took a firm grip on the barrel of the gun with both hands and slammed the butt on the deer's head. It finished the deer, and it didn't do the rifle any good either. Bing felt pretty badly about returning the rifle with a broken stock to his father-in-law, Burton Corman, who was good enough to lend it to him. Bing will probably never forget his feelings when he finally realized the damage he had done to a walnut stock that Mr. Corman had spent hours fitting to the gun, only to do it all over again. I do not remember the total score for the year, more than likely just the two. One thing for sure, no one was too enthusiastic about returning to that cold island. Lib's father passed on September 28, 1954, in his 81st year. He had lived a good life as far as health is concerned, never having suffered a serious illness in his entire life. He started young in the business world as a wholesale fruit salesman, and was still young when he became a partner in the McBride Bros wholesale outlet in Toronto. His brother John disagreed so often that by the year 1910 they dissolved the partnership and Pa took his share in money. John continued the business. There must have been a good sum because Pa bought a number of houses and 2 stores and promptly retired to live on the rent money. The government forced him to take a job in the munitions factory during the First World War, but otherwise he lived retired until the Depression of 1929. Foolishly, he left mortgages on all his property, and as quickly as the rent money failed to come in, the trust company took his properties one at a time. Rather than face bankruptcy while still among his relatives and friends, he decided to move far away to suffer alone. They lived for 1 year on Grosvenor Avenue in Hamilton, and in April of 1928 they moved to the farm across the road. Jim McBride, another brother, had made his money keeping chickens, so Pa figured he could do the same. He filled the barn with laying hens and very soon lost most of his investment. As the Depression progressed, Pa was forced to take whatever job was available in the sales line, and Lib managed to get a part-time job in Eaton's of Hamilton. There was a small amount of money from the sale of fruit from the 7 acres, but Pa was no farmer, and with no equipment, the whole picture was grim. Finally, through the political channels, he was made foreman of repairs on No. 8 highway from the Lincoln County line to Hamilton. He retained the job as long as the Liberal government was in power. Like my own father, Pa had a drinking problem in his younger days, with this difference. Every time he went on a spree, his disposition became entirely miserable, and the next day he would be violently ill. Having expelled all the alcohol from his system, he was at least free of effects until the urge came for the next spree. Giving the man his due, in spite of all the heartache and anguish he caused his family, when their welfare was seriously threatened by lack of funds, he kicked the habit permanently. Lib and I know full well that both Florence and Norma feel that our attitude towards drinking is a little prudish and somewhat ridiculous, but I feel sure that if they had witnessed the troubles in both our families, they would be influenced as we were. Especially after being told by our family doctor, Dr. Vanderberg, that the odds were great that we would have the same affinity for alcohol as our parents. The only reasonable answer, don't start. Pa had a jovial nature and was sometimes interrupted by a violent temper, and in spite of being small in stature, he was inclined to be a bit of a bully. He was soft-hearted and sentimental, and yet would occasionally do mean things to the ones he liked the most. His attitude in business was, let the buyer beware, but would not stop to dishonesty. He very rarely came out second best on any business deal. Just for instance, the little farm produced a good number of plums on the wild shoots that were allowed to grow. Some were blue and some were yellow. Their average size was about the same as cherries. He took the yellow ones to market, sang the praises of the new golden drops, and sold every basket for more money than the good plums. Pa didn't have a clue about machinery and yet seems to make pretty good buys. When they moved into the farmhouse, he was driving a 1925 Willis Knight, the biggest, longest, and highest car on the road, with enough windows to pass as a greenhouse. They must have made very few, because I do not recall seeing another one on the road. That thing was fantastic. The motor was a sleeve type, with no valves and only 4 cylinders. It had no pickup, but could cruise forever at a pretty good speed without any maintenance care. It smoked like a diesel, and I doubt if he had ever changed the oil. Just kept adding. He drove it as a car for many years, in fact, until his job on the highway required him to supply a truck, for which he would be paid mileage. He then cut the back half off and made a small platform to take its place. This served until the highway department gave him a 3-ton International snowplow and all. He had no use for the truck of his own, so he had Del Pierce strip it down and change it into a smaller tractor to be used on the farm. After several years, he traded it for a Cleveland Caterpillar orchard tractor. That tractor came close to killing him several times because it would stand on its tail nearly every time he crossed a small ditch or tried to climb a sharp grade. The hand crank served 2 jobs, as a lever to shift gears and as a starting crank for the motor. He frequently parked the tractor in the basement of the barn facing the eastern stone wall. One time he removed the crank from the gear shift and inadvertently left the tractor in a forward gear. The first pull started the tractor forward with the motor running, just above idle speed. He then had no time to get out of the way before it reached a stone wall. Luckily, the large flat drive pulley protruded far enough in front of the tractor to allow him to put one leg on each side of it and have enough room for his body between the stone wall and the front of the tractor. It is a wonder he didn't have a heart attack while he waited for it to run out of gas or stall. As it happened, all Pa suffered was a few minor cuts and bruises in the inside of his legs and a deflated ego. Bert and Bill, the Metcalf twins, whom I had mentioned previously in this record, spent nearly every summer holiday season with the McBrides because their parents, Audrey and Bill, felt they would enjoy all the advantages of country living. Pa thought those boys were the best ever. The bond between them grew stronger with each passing year from the time they were 2 years old until they were 14. This would be 1940, or when Mrs. McBride became ill with internal cancer and died in February of 1941. They remained very close during the following years and returned every favor their grandfather had ever shown them by tenfold before his death in 1954. There are many things I would like to add about raising hogs. By 1954, we were selling nearly 300 hogs in a year to be butchered, so by now we were well past the hobby stage. Most farmers fed hogs the conventional way, with chopped grain, which was a high protein and mineral supplement added. The brand names like Purina, Suregain, and a few others all mixed feed for hogs for their own secret formulas, which were in each case claimed to be the best. The trouble here was they were all priced to make sure that the feed man got most of the profits. Each of these companies had experimental or model farms operated with the idea of supplying information to all those who would buy their product. Each company had many different mixtures. A pig starter, which contained over 18% protein plus vitamins and minerals, a hog grower which was cut down to about 12% protein, and a hog finisher, again cut to 10%. The rule of thumb was to feed each young pig on pig starter until it had consumed about 100 pounds, which usually took about 8 weeks. Switch to hog grower, which was considerably cheaper, and feed until the pig weighed over 150 pounds. As the name implies, hog finisher, again cheaper, was to be fed until the pig reached 210 to 220 pounds. The overall program required about 400 pounds of feed to produce 100 pounds of pork, or somewhere between 900 pounds and 1,000 pounds for each hog in a time period of about 6 months. The first few pounds of weight gain were by far the slowest and the most expensive. In fact, once a hog reached the 150-pound plateau, it could easily gain in excess of 2 pounds per day over a period of about 35 days. From a dollar standpoint, if you followed the feed company's program, a $5 profit on each hog sold in a year was considered very good for your many efforts. This, of course, does not allow rent or depreciation in the building, fire insurance, tax on your own labor to be added into the costs. In other words, a large volume of saleable hogs was your only hope. Because all the big feed companies were also happy to sell concentrate of their own secret formula, many farmers use their own grown grain to help cut costs. These concentrates contain meat meal, tankage, dehydrated soybean meal, and alfalfa hay, minerals, and who knows what in order to end up with a high concentration of protein. Some farmers put finely ground oats or barley in one bin and concentrate in another bin with a good supply of fresh water and let the hogs make their own mixture. It is amazing how close those would come to the proper mixture. Ralph Knappman and myself were unique among hog growers because we had access to large quantities of ice cream cones, stale bread, and skim milk at a very low cost. Skim milk is considered to be one of the best hog feeds, but difficult to handle. In fact, the feed companies tried desperately to find a dry substitute without success. Ice cream cones were no better than the white flour from which they were made, with possibly a little gain from the shortening of sugar in the recipe and no roughage or minerals, and only 4% protein. So here we have a food loaded with carbohydrates and a little else. Ralph and I tried nearly everything as an additive to boost the food value without getting out of line in the cost angle. The biggest trouble was the time it took to prove or disprove our many guesses. Finally, I decided to ask McDonald University in Montreal to send me what information they had on food analysis. Being in agricultural college, they sent me a booklet entitled Feed and Meal Mixtures, which proved to be of great value. In it were tabulated every natural grain, varieties of grasses, manufactured foods, and byproducts with a complete analysis of each. Boy, did I learn a lot. Just for instance, brewer's yeast was analyzed on the bag tag as containing 43% protein, which was probably true, but when you look in the book, you learn that only 12% is actually available because the remainder cannot be assimilated by hogs. The book and the tag agreed on the vitamin content, which was high in vitamin B. The only guesswork now remaining was the quantities of each food required to bring our mixture up to par. I built a giant mixmaster which held 200 gallons. It was a cylindrical steel tank supported on 4 3-foot legs with an opening in the top to receive and a flapper valve to allow me to drain it into a 40-gallon barrel, which was on 2 small wheels with push handles on one end and a spout on the other. The top of the mixmaster was about 2 feet from the ceiling, placed under a hole through which all the dry feed could be shoveled from the feed storage upstairs. The 3,000-gallon storage tank for milk was connected to the mixmaster by a 3-inch steel pipe which had a valve for easy control of quantity and speed of delivery. The milk tank was also upstairs, placed just inside the big doors, so that I could drain the 500-gallon tank mounted onto my truck into it. A small propeller mounted on the long shaft and driven by a 1/2 horsepower electric motor was submerged to the bottom of the tank, kept the curds, and they were all mixed at an even consistency. The water supply came from a 200-gallon open-top tank, supported on 4 5-foot legs and heated, for winter feeding, by a coil-fired jacket heater. Another large valve controlled the amount of water required for each batch in the mixmaster. The ice cream cones were stored on the 3rd floor above the milk tank and put up there by means of a conveyor, on which they were dumped one bag at a time from my second truck. So, when it was time to feed the pigs, this was the procedure. Turn on the 1 horsepower motor that drives the Mixmaster. Open both water and milk valves to the proper speed. Climb the ladder to the second floor and dump about 300 pounds of finely chopped oats and barley into the mixture, then 6 or 7 scoop shovels of dehydrated alfalfa pellets, 10 or 12 pounds of brewer's yeast, and finally enough ice cream cones or bread to end up with a mixture that will easily flow out of the 4-inch flapper valves on the bottom of the Mixmaster. Time? Less than 15 minutes. By the time you get back downstairs and shut off both milk and water valves, you are ready to deliver the proper amount of the mixture to each pen of pigs by means of the 40-gallon barrel. The flapper valve is easily actuated by one quick motion, up to open or down to close, and the barrel is just as easily dumped into the desired trough, so the time for this job should not exceed another 15 minutes. This tankful will feed up to 250 hogs, depending entirely on the proportions of large hogs in the barn at that time. It is not hard to understand how difficult it could be to maintain an overall weight of hogs in the barn. Monday was my usual shipping day, and the number of hogs varied from 6 to 22, a full load for my truck. Wednesday was my buying day at Boston, Ontario, about 50 miles from home, and the number I bought varied from 20 to 50, depending on what size of young pigs were available that day. The name of the game was to keep every pen loaded to capacity and an even flow of finished hogs to the butcher, as it was hopeless to try to outguess the price of trends of pork, even though you could be sure that the price per pound could fluctuate as much as 12 cents. It could easily happen that the most expensive young pigs would bring the lowest price of the entire year when sold as pork 4 months later. It boils down this way. The pork price and the price of young pigs invariably rose and fell together, so if you replace the pigs that were sold in the same week, the chances of being hurt by price changes were minimized. This explains partially why those farmers who go in and out of the hog-raising business very often took a severe beating. Jack Orr bought about 100 young shoats one fall because he figured he had a chance to use up some of his hired man's spare time during the winter months. It turned out that, by the time he paid for the pigs and the feed, which I think was purina, plus some straw for bedding, all that was left over was a big pile of manure and the experience. Nothing at all for the labor or anything else, and keep in mind that Jack is an excellent bookkeeper. With our system of feeding, we could cut the feed costs by at least 40%, which in turn boosted the normal $5 profit to as high as $15. My books, as poorly kept as they are, will prove that I never failed to show a profit in a year's operation, and that some years were fantastic. End of chapter 13.